I'm Stephen Furl. I'm the Dean of USD School of Law, and it is my pleasure to welcome you all to the 12th Annual Joan E. Bowes James Madison Distinguished Speaker Series. Before I introduce our distinguished speaker, I'd like to say a few words about this speaker series, which is made possible through the generosity, spirit, and sheer drive of Joan E. Bowes. Continuing a family passion for learning, Joan established this distinguished speaker series through our law school to inspire students and other members of the San Diego community and to promote the open exchange of ideas. Bearing the name of James Madison, fourth President of the United States and father of the Constitution, this annual series brings distinguished speakers from the fields of law, diplomacy, government, and politics to the University of San Diego and to the San Diego community. We thank Joan for her support and her patronage and extend a special welcome to Joan tonight because tonight happens to be Joan's birthday. Happy birthday, Joan. Joan, would you like to say a word or two? I know it's hard for you to get up, but... No? Okay. Oh, well, thank you, Joan. And, you know, it's great to have you here. Joining us tonight are many of Joan's special friends who have now become special friends of this university and of the law school. And we welcome you all back. Many of you have come to, some of you I know have come to every one of these lectures, right? I know there are a few of you there, and many of you have come to many of them. And it's always a pleasure to welcome you here. And we look forward to having the opportunity to get to know you at the reception and to seeing you at future Bowes-Madison lectures. I'm also happy to welcome members of the community and friends and students who join us for the first time. And I encourage all of you to continue to attend this speaker's event and other events that we have here in the law school and the university. I do not believe in long introductions. You didn't come here to hear me. You came here to hear our speaker. But I do want to give a brief introduction of tonight's speaker. Charles Murray is currently William H. Brady Scholar at the American Enterprise Institute. Prior to that, he was a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute for Policy Research from 1982 to 1990. He was a research scientist with the American Institutes for Research from 1969 to 70, and again from 1974 to 1981. He served as a Peace Corps volunteer and U.S. aid contractor in Thailand from 1965 to 1969. He told us earlier he lived in Thailand for a total of 13 years. He received his Bachelor of Arts in History at Harvard University and a PhD in Political Science at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He is an author of many books and articles, far too many for me to recite at this time. He's joining us this evening to talk about his most recent book, By the People, Rebuilding Liberty Without Permission, and I know that several of you have read the book. As one reviewer, Edward Crane, of the President Emeritus of the Cato Institute, has written about the book, quote, "The book is a roadmap to recapture true American exceptionalism with passion, brilliance, and a keen sense of the radical essence of what America means. Murray dismisses what passes for political debate today and offers an audacious plan to restore the liberty our founders bequeathed to us." It is now my pleasure to welcome Charles Murray to USD.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Ms. Bowes, for the honor of being invited to give the lecture this year. Now, this is a university audience, and when I'm in front of university audiences, I have to assume that not everyone is of the same political persuasion that I am. And so I like to make the lectures ones that everybody can profit from. However, there's a problem with this particular book, By the People, because it is explicitly, and alone among my books, it is explicitly addressed to people who are devoted to limited government as the founders originally described it. And I make no bones about that. I do promise to those of you in the audience who do not share this libertarian or conservative perspective, whichever you want, that there are not going to be any cheap shots about your point of view, but I will go ahead and just vigorously express the theses of the book. They are twofold. First is that the American project, as the founders intended it, is dead. It's not dying, it's dead. The second, you'll be glad to know, is a little more optimistic, and that is that we are now seeing opportunities for restoring de facto a lot of what the American project originally intended, but in a new form. Let me start with defining what the American project means as I see it. It is the idea that people can be left alone as individuals and as families and communities to live their lives as they see fit, with the role of government being to provide a peaceful setting for that endeavor and otherwise standing aside. When I say that is dead, it's not dead for most of the people in this audience, de facto. De facto, most of us pretty much live our lives as we see fit, but the way we do that is because we have the resources, both financial and intellectual and of other kinds, to do workarounds. So the government really can be a bother to us, sometimes more than a bother, but for most things, we are able to live our lives pretty much as we see fit. That is not what the American idea was all about. America broke with history. The notion that everybody was entitled to pursue happiness, that it was not to be reserved to an elite, was central to that idea, and that is the aspect of it that I fear is gone. And I'm going to spend the first maybe 15 minutes, 20 minutes of this presentation making that case. Why am I going to spend that much time making those of you who share my point of view miserable about it being dead? It's because I want to rid you of your illusions. And the illusion is this, that we can use the political process to roll back the power of government. Now, you can use the political process to do a lot of good things. You can use the political process to have better education policy, to have better welfare policy, to make all sorts of improvements, but those are not the same as rolling back the role that government has taken in American life. Let me go through some of the reasons for that statement. And let's start out with the Constitution, which I do so with a little apprehension because there are people in this room who know a lot more about the U.S. Constitution than I do, but I'm making a fairly simple set of statements. When I started to write the book, I was under the impression that if only we could get 9 Nino Scalias or 9 Clarence Thomases on the court, that we could do a lot to return to something a lot closer to the Constitution that James Madison had in mind. I was wrong. What happened was not that during the course of American history we sort of slid into new interpretations of the Constitution that we can slide out of. On the contrary, during the course of the 1930s, especially a set of about half a dozen decisions from 1937 to 1942, the court explicitly said, we are now reinterpreting the Constitution to mean X, and once you've done that, you can't go home again. Take, for example, the key decision Helvering v. Davis in 1937, which said that the Social Security Act was constitutional. The person who wrote the decision was Cardozo, and in there he says, well, there has been a long-standing dispute about the meaning of the phrase general welfare that introduces the enumerated powers. And he then, I can't quote it exactly, it's in the book, and then he says, there have been many distinguished statesmen who have held one view. We are now deciding by decision that they were wrong, and that we have sided with Hamilton, who, now don't get me started on this because I go into kind of a rant when I get onto the subject of Alexander Hamilton. During the course of the constitutional ratification debates, there was only one interpretation of that phrase, general welfare, which introduces the enumerated powers, and that is it was meaningless. That it was just a rhetorical way of introducing the enumerated powers. The enumerated powers were supreme. Congress could not spend on the general welfare. Even Alexander Hamilton never said that you could spend on the general welfare during the course of the ratification debates. He kept quiet until a few years after the Constitution was safely ratified, when he came out with his idea that 150 years later was used by the Supreme Court to say Congress can pretty much spend money on anything that advances the general welfare. Now, given that, suppose you had the ideal Supreme Court. Suppose they said Cardozo and the others who voted for him in 1937 were wrong. That's not what the founders have in mind. We reverse it. 90% of all federal spending, maybe 95%, would be unconstitutional of all the non-defense spending. No Supreme Court can do that. No president would enforce that decision. The legitimacy of the Supreme Court would be shattered. In that decision, also in the decisions involving the Commerce Clause, you had a fundamental change in the Constitution that cannot be undone. The second aspect that makes it impossible to roll back the government through the political process has to do with a legal system that is increasingly lawless. A lot of you probably have read Arthur C. Clarke, who was a famous science fiction writer. He was famous for having said at one point that technology sufficiently advanced is indistinguishable from magic. It was a great phrase to indicate the way in which, if you don't know what a radio is magic. Well, in the same sense, law that is sufficiently complex is indistinguishable from lawlessness. Let me give you a couple of examples, not only complex, but subjective. When you have a law, such as Dodd-Frank, that is hundreds of pages long, there is no way you can obey that law in the same way that you can obey a law against robbery. The only way you can obey the law is if you have not a lawyer, but platoons of lawyers who are constantly ransacking what the federal government has most recently said to tell you, maybe you can do this and maybe you can't, the probability is such and such you can get away with it. That's indistinguishable from lawlessness in any important way. Law is indistinguishable from lawlessness if it's simply too expensive for you to pursue it. I will be talking a lot about the role of the regulatory state, but here's the reality. If when the government makes an accusation that you have violated a regulation, you know you cannot try to fight that because you will spend tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands, or if you're a corporation, maybe millions of dollars in legal fees, and so you give in what sense are you protected by the rule of law? But it's worst of all in terms of the actual structure of the regulatory state. Why am I focusing on regulatory state right now? Because when I say that the government is preventing us from living our lives as we see fit, it's primarily through the thousands of regulations that have been created in which we are unable to practice our vocations the way that we see fit to provide the best possible services or goods, the ways in which we cannot use our property as we see fit, even if all we're trying to do is be good stewards of our property. It's in the regulatory state that we face all the ways in which we can no longer enjoy the American freedom that the founders wanted to give to us. Those of you who are lawyers, most of you in this room know how the regulatory state works legally. Some of you do not. So let me enlighten you. It's kind of scary. It's as if you had a system in which the police selected the judges in the courtroom selected the people who would be on the reviewing court, and that not only that, but the same body created the very laws that were being enforced and adjudicated. If you are accused of violating a regulation, you don't go to a regular court. You don't go to have a court in which you have a jury of your peers. You go to an administrative court. So if you are accused of violating an EPA regulation, you go to an administrative court in which the judge is an employee of EPA. Oh, an employee who has all sorts of guarantees of independence, but a judge that has been selected by the EPA. The actual regulations that are created are very seldom ones that implement something that Congress said you were supposed to do. This goes back to the Supreme Court again. It used to be that given that all legislative power is vested in the Congress of the United States, that Congress had to spell out in the legislation what it wanted the government to do. It had to have an intelligible principle. In a famous Supreme Court case in the early 1940s, the Supreme Court dispensed with that requirement. So it's okay for the federal government to say, we want clean air. And they have some description of what clean air ought to mean, but it really leaves a lot of room for interpretation, and the interpretation of that is confided to the regulatory agencies. They can make up laws. They can do that without ceasing because there is no limit on what they can define as being clean air in the case of the Clean Air Act. The result of all this is as if you go into court, accused by the EPA of doing something wrong, judged by the EPA whether you did or did not do something wrong, you appeal to the EPA's Court of Appeals, which also consists of judges that are hired by the EPA. If you ever do get into a regular court, which is sometimes possible, you then run into something called Chevron deference, after a famous Supreme Court of that name, in which the court said, well, as long as there is a rationale for what the regulation that was created, we will defer to the judgment of the regulatory agency. That is the Orwellian world of administrative law. You are not going to roll back the regulatory state through the political process because, in effect, the regulatory state is extra-legal. It sits outside the ordinary structure of American law. The next reason for complete and utter pessimism about what we can do is the systemic corruption of the American political process. By that, I don't mean that senators and congressmen are more venal than they used to be. I don't mean that they are on the take more than they used to be. It's systemic. Think of a kleptocracy in Central Asia or Sub-Saharan Africa or Southeast Asia, where you can only get things done if you pay bribes. You can't get the attention of an official to hear your case unless you pay a bribe. You can't get a decision in your favor unless you pay a bribe. But the good thing is you can get lots of things done if you do pay the appropriate bribes. You can even get special laws passed that will accommodate your particular needs. It's a very efficient system in that sense. Proposition: if you substitute for the word bribe political contribution, I have just described the way that American government operates. If you are a corporation and you have a good case to take up with your senator, I don't care if the senator is a Republican or a Democrat, you will not get a hearing unless you've made the appropriate contribution. If there is something that you want to appeal to the regulatory state to be changed and you want your representative to get hold of the appropriate bureaucrat and make your case, that will not happen unless you give the political contribution. It's true of both parties. It is built in now to the system through the lobbying mechanism, whereby you have an iron triangle in which you will never get the government to pass sweeping reforms because there are just way too many special interests. That it's the faction, for those of you who remember your Federalist Papers, it's the factions that Madison was so frightened of that have now taken over the system. And finally, and I'll conclude this litany of complaints about the current system, you have the problem that was identified by Mansur Olson. Mansur Olson was an economist at the University of Maryland who wrote a couple of seminal books that talked about what's happened to advanced American democracy. And what he said was essentially this: there is an asymmetry between organizing people who really, really want some special favor from government and organizing opposition to that. Sugar subsidy. A lot of you are probably aware that we pay about twice the world price for sugar. We do that to benefit a really small number of sugar growers. We have tried to repeal that time and again, most recently just a year and a half ago. It just doesn't make any sense. There's lots of sugar out there in the world. There's no reason to subsidize this little group to force the rest of us to pay twice the world price for sugar, but the sugar producers really, really care about that benefit. The 99.99999% of us who don't grow sugar don't care that much, and it's really hard to get us organized. Now think in terms of not just a dozen or 2 dozen or 100, but thousands of these kinds of situations in which you have a special interest that really cares. It is really out there influencing the votes of senators and members of the House of Representatives versus a very diffuse public that can't be organized in opposition to it. You cannot roll back government because of the kind of sclerosis that is built into it. Okay, enough of the doom and gloom. Here's the good news. In many respects, this government that I have just described that has gotten out of control in terms of its interference with daily life, this government that I have described that you cannot really roll back, is the Wizard of Oz. Looking around the room, almost all of you have seen The Wizard of Oz. When I'm talking to an audience of 22-year-olds, it's not so clear that people know what I'm talking about. But we've all seen The Wizard of Oz. You remember the story. Wizard of Oz is very scary, big booming voice. At the end of the movie, they pull aside the curtain in this booth where the Wizard of Oz is, and it's this balding, overweight old guy. This is getting kind of personal at this point, but old guy who is kind of pathetic. And he's not scary at all. There's an element of that in the federal government. Directed against any one of us, the government is really scary. The enforcement capabilities of that government are actually very thin. The reason they can get away with all of these thousands of regulations is because we voluntarily comply. What if there were a way of pushing back? A couple of points I want to make at this juncture. I am not complaining about regulations that prevent factories from having noxious smoke come out of their smokestacks. I am not railing against regulations that insist that coal mine owners have sturdy supports for their tunnels and their mines. Those things, I'm not a pure libertarian. There's a place for that kind of regulation. I'm not talking about that. Here's the kind of thing I'm talking about. This happened last night. I've got other examples in the book, but this one came up at a dinner party that Gail and her husband had for me last night, where you had a dentist there at the dinner party who recently had a new compressor that the inspector said she would have to replace. I'm not making this up, because the tag on the compressor was paper instead of metal. $5,000 it cost her to do what the federal government wanted her to do in that regard. An even more bizarre case, and so bizarre that I won't say this is typical, but it's true, is the bartender who was fined $3,000 for not carding a customer. The customer that she failed to card was her father. You know, it's a kind of case where you say, what kind of bureaucrat can come into that kind of situation and not laugh and say, okay, I know technically you're supposed to have carded your father, but don't worry about it. That's the problem, that you have all sorts of regulations, thousands of regulations, which either are silly in and of themselves, or even more often, are enforced in silly ways. I'll tell you how the solution to all of this came to me. True story. My wife and I have a friend who runs a business that I will not describe in any detail because I don't want to get him in trouble. But like all people involved in this industry, he hires Latinos to work for him, Latinos who are brought into the country. The difference between him and everybody else who hires them off the books and undocumented, he gets visas for all of them every year, brings them up from Central America. He spends about 25 grand a year going through the visa process. In doing so, he has made himself visible. And because he's visible, he has been relentlessly harassed for violating this regulation and that regulation that have nothing to do with the health and welfare of his workers. He's a good employer, paying good wages. He's just an easy target. And at one point, he said, when he was accused of violating a particularly idiotic regulation, "I'm going to fight this in court." To which the bureaucrat said, "You try that and we'll put you out of business." I see a few heads nodding in the audience. I bet you either know of people or have had an experience yourself where you've run into that kind of threat. And he knew that would be true if he did try to fight it. When my wife was telling me about this, I got so angry that at first I said, "I don't want to hear any more of this. It's just driving me nuts." But then I had, epiphany is an awfully fancy word to describe it, but I did have this image of suddenly a guy in a pinstripe suit showing up with a briefcase, maybe on a horse, maybe not. I can't remember whether I specified that. And he said, "We are taking this man's case. We know he is technically guilty of this idiotic regulation you've accused him of violating. We don't care. We are going to make your life miserable. We are going to litigate this because you know what? Yes, the current court system is sclerotic. Yes, it is way too complex. Yes, it has all these defects that we should fix. But guess what? We can exploit that just like you can. And so you can go ahead and pursue this. We will force you to do all sorts of work you don't want to do, spend lots more hours in this than you want to spend, and at the end of it all, we will first publicize it, and you by name, which is something bureaucrats don't like at all. We will publicize it with you by name, and then we will pay the fine when you finally find him guilty." And then I said to myself, this could work. Suppose there was a way to push back. Suppose an ordinary small business person could say, "I've got good news. The Madison Fund," because that's what I call this philanthropic fund, rather appropriately for the name of this series, the Madison Fund is taking my case. If you had a philanthropic organization that took on these cases, and they establish a track record over a couple of years, and they will have to establish a track record, they have to make good on their threat. But once they've done that, as soon as they announce the Madison Fund is taking this case, bureaucrats are going to back off a huge majority of the time. You can de facto make large chunks of the regulatory code unenforceable. Now, what I have just said is that I am advocating massive, systematic civil disobedience. That's a serious thing to do. The rule of law is, in fact, the foundation of any free society. You do not disregard the rule of law lightly. However, the situation I just described in the earlier part of this presentation is one in which the rule of law has been so corrupted that I think it is appropriate to drag it kicking and screaming back towards something closer to what ordinary people consider to be justice. It can be done not only through a large philanthropic organization which takes on cases for ordinary Americans. I'm wrongly positioned with regard to these microphones. I'm not just talking about that, I'm talking about a much broader potential. Let's go back to the case of the person I met last night, the dentist. Suppose the dentists had a legal defense fund, where in effect the American Dental Association said, "We have very high professional standards for how you are supposed to operate dental practice. That's true, by the way, of almost all professional organizations. If you run your dental practice according to our standards, and you are harassed by OSHA or the EPA or one of the other many regulatory agencies for something that has nothing to do with good dentistry, we will take your case. Suppose that were done for all kinds of industries, plumbers, all kinds of craftspeople. In a lot of different ways, you could create a situation in which the government essentially is forced to back off from silly enforcement of silly rules. Let me now give you a few reasons why not only could this specific strategy work, but we are actually looking at a propitious moment, I think, for a much broader rollback of the intrusive role of government. All sorts of things are happening that are moving in the right direction. A lot of them are driven by technology. You know, if it were 1910 and meatpacking inspection had been passed, I'd have to admit there were some really strong rationales for having the government inspect meat. In 1910, it was really hard for the consumer to know what was going on in meatpacking plants. It was really hard to know what ingredients were being put into products. There was an argument then saying, you know, the only way we can protect the consumer is by having the government step in. That rationale is gone. If tomorrow you got rid of the laws requiring government inspection of meat, and Safeway said, oh good, we're going to start selling contaminated meat and making a few extra pennies, it would be all over the internet within 24 hours, and Safeway would go bankrupt, in addition to being sued for hundreds of millions of dollars. But that wouldn't happen anyway. What would happen if the government stopped inspecting meat is Safeway would have an ad campaign saying, truthfully, that actually our own standards for inspecting meat and our own thoroughness in actually inspecting the meat is already a lot better than anything the government ever did, and they would publicize all the ways in which the consumers were being protected. For that matter, consider the role of the government in all sorts of things where information used to be hard to come by and now isn't. Lots of you probably have medical questions about pharmaceuticals and medical procedures and a variety of issues. How many of you go to a government website for that, and how many of you go to WebMD? Yeah. You name it. We have access to information now that was undreamt of before, and that just destroy the rationales for all kinds of government intrusions. Then there are all the ways in which we can establish workarounds. Uber. U-B-E-R. As of 10 years ago, nobody could have imagined that the monopolies created by taxi companies in collusion with city councils could be broken up. I would have made a speech up here 10 years ago talking about those, in which I would have said just as categorically, you can't get rid of those, just as I got done saying you can't roll back government through the political process. I could not have imagined that you could have an organization like Uber which doesn't ask permission to move in. They just move in and start offering a really valuable service that people really like. And by the time the city council and the taxi monopoly get their act together, there is a political price to be paid for opposing it. That's what happened in Washington, D.C. The city council voted to outlaw Uber, and all at once they realized that there was going to be a political price to be paid, and they changed their minds. And also, you have a situation now where the private organization has such deep pockets that it can take on the government. Airbnb, which rents out rooms independently, the hotel industry is another example. My point is not that either one of those, in and of themselves, is a huge deal in terms of restoring autonomy to a lot of us and living our lives as we see fit. My point is that we are at the bottom of a steep, probably non-linear set of possibilities, and that they are only going to get better and better as time goes on. Then there is one other aspect that I think is perhaps the most underestimated of all. a lot of you in this audience who perhaps do not agree with my politics on a liberal to conservative continuum probably resonate with some of the objections to the ways in which the government has simply gotten too overweening, too big for its britches, and needs to be pulled back. It cuts across party lines. Consider this. In 1958, the Gallup organization began asking a question. The question has been asked with precisely the same wording ever since. The question goes like this: do you trust the federal government to do the right thing all of the time, most of the time, or only some of the time? 1958, about 74% of all Americans trusted the government to do the right thing most or all of the time. In the most recent poll just released yesterday, I think, that was down to 19%. And you know what? That's better than 2 years ago when it was only 13%. That decline is not the fault of Barack Obama alone. It started to decline in 1964 and had a steep decline thereafter. That's not partisan. When you only have less than 1 out of 5 Americans who trust the government to do the right thing, even most of the time, you have seen an alienation that cuts across party lines. And in this lies, I think, the potential for a coalition over time whereby conservatives and liberals can begin to agree to disagree on certain policy issues and on others join in saying to the government, back off, this is none of your business. In the long term, then, I'm optimistic. Now, mind you, in the long term, we're all dead. We know that. But it's still to me inspiriting to think that after a time in which it looked like we were going to be heading toward a monolithic government that we were unable to stem in any way, we are now facing a situation in which there are realistic, practicable ways in which we can reclaim a great deal of the American heritage of living our lives as we see fit. Why is it such a big deal? If, in fact, we're doing pretty well, those of us in this room. It's a big deal because America was unique in that regard. No other country in the history of the world was established with a charter that explicitly said the government is extremely limited in what it is permitted to do. It is the people who call the shots for the government, not the other way around. No other country since the American Constitution has tried to imitate us in that regard. No other existing country has changed its constitution to be more like us. This is not to say that the United States is the only great place to live. I know of at least half a dozen more countries that I could have lived a satisfying life in throughout the world. Rather, we were unique insofar as we had a civic culture fostered by that independence and that individualism that was unlike any other in the world. It wasn't Americans who made up the notion of American exceptionalism. It was observers from abroad during the 19th century who came here and saw the voluntary cooperation that sprang up in towns and neighborhoods to solve problems, who saw a vibrant civic culture in which people didn't wait for the government to do things, we did them ourselves, and it inspired people from around the world to come here to share in that kind of freedom. If that were to disappear, it would not mean that we could no longer live satisfying lives. It means that we would not be able to do so in a uniquely American context. For those of you who think, as I do, that that is an immeasurably important, irreplaceable asset, the loss of that heritage would be immeasurably tragic. Thank you very much. We have left plenty of time for discussion, and unlike when you have lecture halls with 400 undergraduates, you don't need to make them questions. If you have positions that you'd like to describe, we can discuss those too. And just put up your hands and I will call upon you at random. Yes, sir.
First question for you. Do you like fish?
Do I like fish?
The reason I ask is because there have been several stories over the past several months that have explained how in supermarkets like Safeway, when you go to buy tuna, it's not actually tuna. It's some other cheaper fish. So I don't understand how you can inveigh against meat inspection. It doesn't have to be that they're selling us tainted meat, which will kill us the next day. They could put in some other low-grade meat that we might not know about, or or it could be something that might kill us in 30 years. The cigarette manufacturers sold us products that would kill us in 30 years, and they came.
How did you learn that the grocery stores are selling tuna that's not tuna? How did you learn about it?
Has read the story? I mean,
Yeah, you read the stories. You read the stories.
There's been DNA tested.
Yeah, how did you hear about it? It wasn't because the government publicized it. It's because of the kinds of access to information we have now. And here's the next point. You take an organization like Whole Foods. Whole Foods gets a big marketing advantage because it jumps on things like that, and it can point out ways in which you ought to buy things at Whole Foods. What we are talking about is a practice that occurred that's not killing anybody, it's not hurting anybody, that is selling a product under false pretenses, and who would you rather have in charge of exposing that? Would you rather trust to the federal government to figure that out, or would you rather trust to the sources that you actually use to hear about it?
Well, it seems to me that the federal government has done a reasonable job in many cases. I mean, you can look at thalidomide. I mean, any number of examples of government regulation, which.
We aren't going to argue about. As I said, I agree that there have been things that have been happened in the past where I think government regulation is appropriate. I guess, sir, that what I'm saying is that the kind of thing you are raising is precisely the kind of problem that we now have other solutions for. I'm going to go to another. Yes.
You've hedged your position by saying that there are some types of regulation you're in favor of. You referred to the founders as championing liberty, but as you know, the founders also believed in science. Joel Barlow even wrote an ode to science. And one of the developments in science is the discovery that we have a problem of global warming. I wonder if you agree with Senator Inhofe that it's simply a hoax, and if you don't, whether you think that government ought to do something about carbon emissions. The second point I'd like to make, which relates to something you said, and which I agree with, is that our politics is easily corrupted by campaign contributions. And I wonder if you're in favor of getting rid of all restrictions on campaign contributions, or whether you're in favor of something like McCain's Feingold regulation of campaign financing. It seems to me there's a contradiction in your position. If you really believe that everything should be left to the play of individuals, then either on global warming or on campaign financing, you have to be against all regulation.
Well, let's start with climate change. There are things that science is able to do, that hard sciences are able to do, that are indispensable. And part of that has to do with something like global warming. The problem is this, that when it comes to policy, the corruption of the sciences has become profound. So that I am an interested agnostic observer of the global warming debate. I am well-versed in statistics and quantitative methods. I should, with my background, be able to appraise the literature and come to a personal opinion about who's got it right here. Here it seems to me that we have kind of three levels that get progressively more difficult. Is it possible to take the science out there and infer that there is solid evidence that there is some degree of global warming that has occurred? And I think the answer to that is yes, with caveats. When it comes to the question of the role of human beings in creating that change, the answer is probably there is some role, but the caveats, the scientific caveats at this point, are so great that it's hard to pin it down. Then when you come to the question of what would be the actual effect of alternative policy solutions, given what we know about the discrepancy between policy plans and the way they are implemented, we haven't a snowball's chance in hell of understanding what any public policy would actually produce. The problem is this. We know as a documented fact that there have been, on both sides of the global warming debate, scientists who have fabricated data. And the problem is we don't know who has done what. That is a problem which pervades almost every kind of social science, whether you're talking about the assessment of the effects of pre-K education, or the effects or global warming, or almost any other public policy issue. I have had personal reason to know precisely how corrupt social science has become in that regard after my experience with the bell curve. With regard to the campaign finance reform, that's a really interesting story. And it's one that I describe at some length in the book. During the first half of the 1970s, you had a set of reforms that were intended to eliminate the influence of wealthy donors, and so you had limits on campaign financing, and we created inadvertently the PAC system. PACs had existed since the 1940s. They were initially used by unions, but nobody had really started other PACs after that for reasons of, but first, politics was different then. But in addition, there was nothing in which people gave money to candidates, all right? And so suppose that you were a really strong advocate for the environment in the 1970s. Well, you would want to support environmental causes, but there wasn't much in the way of what you could do. Giving a little money to a particular representative wouldn't help very much. And so you probably didn't contribute anything. Further, the large contributors, yeah, they wanted the people they supported to vote right on a few issues. So that if you were elected from Houston to the House of Representatives, you probably better vote the right way on things that Exxon was really interested in. But Exxon was not leaning over your shoulder telling you every vote you ought to make. So the Campaign Reform Act was introduced. And obviously I have to simplify this story in a short answer. But what happened is that contributions that formerly were given to candidates directly, for which there was not a whole lot of detailed oversight by the contributor, were given to PACs. And once PACs started to be formed, it became obvious this is a really great way to get an efficient way for people to contribute to causes. So you could contribute to a variety of environmental causes, and they would then transmit the pressure through their combined revenues to the representatives and senators. It's hard to realize the first lobbying firm that identified itself as a lobbying firm didn't happen until the 1970s. Now, there were lots of things that fed into this, but if you are saying that efforts to control campaign contributions have in any way helped in the effort to diffuse this kleptocratic characteristic we have now, I would argue the empirical record goes exactly the opposite way. We've meant well, but the unintended consequences of our campaign finance reform have been, in my view, quite horrific. Yes.
Getting back to your issue of lawyers stepping in to assist people who are dealing with some problem that's been raised by government, we have in California a group called the Pacific Legal Foundation. I don't know if you're aware of it.
I am.
Well, then could you address how that does the sort of job that you're talking about?
Pacific Legal Foundation is one. It won a very famous case called the Sackett case, which was an environmental case that went all the way to the Supreme Court. The Institute for Justice is another one. There are a couple of others, the Goldwater Institute in Arizona. Here's the difference. Those organizations have very limited resources. The combined budgets of all of them, I think, is about $24 million, which is piddling amount of money. So what they do is they select cases that if they win them, they can leverage them. They have established a precedent. They can have a big effect through winning one case. The strategy I'm talking about does not try to do that. It says it takes ordinary cases where they know they're going to lose because the person is technically guilty of violating the regulation. What they are going to do is provide pushback. And there you have to have the resources initially to pursue a lot of cases, probably numbering in the thousands. As I say, once the track record is established, you have a global effect whereby simply taking the case means the government's probably going to back off. So it's what I would like to see is an expansion of the kind of work that these organizations already do, but in the directions I described. Yes, over in the corner.
I enjoyed your talk. I found one area where there was cognitive dissonance. If people are over time upset with government, I do think there's a difference between Republicans and Democrats because you don't vote for more government when you don't like government. I mean, it just, that part, could you explain that?
You elaborate a little bit.
Okay, so you had mentioned how, with the Gallup poll, how
Oh,
over
yeah,
time
okay, yeah.
people are distrustful, and you said it was bipartisan distrust.
There was a potential for
So,
bipartisan
yeah,
things.
So
yeah.
what about connecting the dots? If you don't think government is to be trusted, why then do you vote to give more big government power?
Oh, no, I was saying that there could be things in which liberals and conservatives can find common cause. Let me go to the case of Uber again. Yes, I know that Hillary Clinton has said she'd be it sounds a little scary to take an Uber car. Look, if you're an old lady who hasn't driven her own car for 30 years, you're going to find it a little scary to be in almost any kind of car. But most people, including a lot of liberals, really like Uber. It's just more convenient. It's better service. It's great. There is a potential there for saying, okay, we'll continue to disagree on how to run healthcare. We'll continue to disagree on welfare policy and all that. We'll agree that this is the kind of thing where competition is good and freedom is good, and we can collaborate on it. And I think that there is. I'll tell you how I think this will come about. Right now, you have a whole lot of moderate Democrats who are not the people who are out there trying to prevent people like me from speaking on college campuses. They aren't out there with all sorts of the crazier causes that we've been seeing recently. But on the other hand, they really don't like the Republicans at all because of social issues. I'll take my own 4 children as an example. They all love their dad, and they aren't rebelling against me, and none of them would ever vote for a Republican. Even though they agree with me on economic policy, they agree with me on a lot of issues of freedom, they really hate the Republicans' social issues, positions regarding gay rights and abortion and other things like that. Suppose you could have people who believe in limited government say, okay, let's put aside those issues. And I think that you have a lot of moderate Democrats who would be willing to say, and we will put aside the people who want to interfere with free speech and the people who want to micromanage your lives. I think there is a much larger potential center there than the current polarized position of politics would lead one to to come up with a few political leaders who actually implement that aspiration of common ground. And we've had a hard time doing that over the last few decades.
Just a lighthearted thing to conclude with, perhaps. In California, you're a little bit left of the rest of the nation, and in your examples of a bad situation, the one I noted just recently, I write about these. There's a company, Chico, that just was driven out of business because the regulators came in, they made pillows, animal-like pillows, and the regulators came in and they found that they're labeled. You know, with pillows, you have to have a label. And the label was in violation. And so the regulator told them that they had to rip out all the labels and replace them with new labels because they used the wrong font. That's a true story. True story. 30 people were put out of business. It was the last straw. Of course, it wasn't by itself the problem. But my point is, I think there's one other aspect that holds hope, and that is we do have 50 states. So when you have a nutball state like California, which is driving manufacturing out in incredible numbers, that there is the fact that we have to compete with the other states, and that actually holds promise. I have hopes in that regard. I don't want to leave, but eventually people who are less well off than myself and maybe want to work for a living, or own a home. There's a lot of crazy people out there. And then maybe there are going to be enough of them going to other states, and the businesses that go to the other states will put the pressure on our government that we really can't do otherwise. So federalism works, I think, in this case, and I'm very upbeat about that.
Well, we have come to the end of the time. I will just say one thing very quickly about, just to reinforce what you're saying, and that is the states are getting feisty among themselves as well. The marijuana legalization in Washington State and Colorado is a case in point. If there's one thing in the Constitution which is absolutely clear, it is that federal law trumps state law. So that no matter what Colorado did, the feds can go into Colorado and arrest everybody under federal law for selling marijuana. The Department of Justice has said explicitly it will not do that because as long as certain guidelines are observed, the Department of Justice has said we're going to ignore some plainly, potentially unconstitutional behavior. You know what? States' rights for a long time was identified with segregation and racists in the South and all that. All at once, states' rights are starting to come to life again. And that, too, is one of the reasons that despite the first 30 minutes of doom and gloom, I am optimistic about what can happen. Thank you so much for having me out to California.